What's up, my friends? This is Middle Child, and I am John Edward Willie. And today I'm recording in the blistering heat while out on a walk. It's about 98 degrees. It feels like 105, and with that humidity. And so, of course, I'm thinking about sunlight. I've recorded other recordings in the dark, and have spoken about the dark as a metaphor for many things. And needless to say, I think sunlight is indicative of many things. In fact, I've considered myself before to be a kind of humanist. In fact, not any kind of humanist, as that can mean a lot of different things, but as a kind of solar humanist. And I can't quite remember where I picked up that phrase. Perhaps I invented it myself, but I say solar humanism because what I'm referring to is the humanism of the South. And what would that be? What would a humanism of the South be? Well, that's something that I inherited from one of my favorites, Albert Camus, who wrote an extraordinary series of books in the early 20th century. My favorite of which, however, are not the most popular. My favorite Albert Camus piece is a little thing that's in the back of his work, The Myth of Sisyphus, and I believe it's called Summer in Algiers. And in Summer in Algiers, Camus makes a series of remarks about sunlight and about its life-giving and life-taking force. And in fact, in that work, he begins to speak about the sun as something that, in fact, prevents him from being a nihilist or nihilist. The sun is something that prevents him from thinking that he can be self-complacent. And I know it sounds strange, so perhaps it's up to me to work through the logic of this, because sunlight for Camus, who, by the way, grew up in Algiers, northern Africa, of course, was French writing author, but the thing about Camus is that he never understood himself to be an existentialist like Sartre was. And the reason that I bring up poverty is that for Camus, poverty and sunlight taught him that not all was well under the sun. And in fact, he said that the reason that he couldn't say that he was the kind of person who didn't believe in anything, because he said that he believed in three things, sunlight, the cool Mediterranean Sea, and his suffering mother, his suffering silent mother. And for me, I've always connected those elements in Camus with the elements in my own life. And I find that even walking in this heat, I'm always reminded of the degree to which the sunlight burns away all that is not essential. So there's a sense in which my own solar humanism is connected not only to the sunlight, but also to the poverty that tends to come with the sunlight. Now, of course, what I mean by that is that the kind of humanism that comes from the South is a Mediterranean humanism. And that's a humanism that's distinguishing itself from the northern kind. And that's the kind of humanism that is found more predominantly in the more rational and positivistic philosophers. But the humanism that comes from the Mediterranean is one that is rooted in less of a didactic intellectual affair and much more of a open-ended worldly affair. So Northern humanism, i.e. what is often like scientific humanism, i.e. figures as diverse as Richard Dawkins or probably Elon Musk, these are figures who have a tendency to think in ways that I do not find affinity with, as someone who is rooted in a kind of humanism that, in fact, takes for granted a particular conception of the world that isn't as optimistic, but is in fact shaped by the poverty of the sunlight. And when I say shaped by, I don't mean shaped by a negative view. It's only to Americans that all of this would appear to be negative. It's really just that the sunlight and poverty that's important to Camus is important to me, because for Camus, it protected us against what is ultimately our greatest obstacle, and that is resentment, the kind of jealousy that can destroy our psychic lives, that kind of sense that you should be something else other than what you are, that sense that people owe you something, the sense that something has been taken away from you, the sense that you ought to be upset with people not being better than they could be. All of this is indicative of the resentment that is so destructive. And the reason it's so common in the North, and at least I'm speaking figuratively, of course, the reason it's less common in the South is that the solar humanism I'm speaking of is one that doesn't begin with the romantic assumption that all things will work out. I mean, you could say that what's unique about, say, Brazil, for instance, or what's unique about Algiers, is that it was never influenced by the romantic. And so it carries with it its own demure, Byzantine character, I guess you could say. And, you know, anytime I speak, I'm always nervous. And that has prevented me from recording or putting my recordings out there in the past. And as I speak now, I'm more nervous than ever, but I'm sort of relaxing into that nervousness, because in order to say any of these thoughts, it requires a tremendous amount of audacity, you know, gumption, presumptuousness, because there's an inherently dangerous quality to thinking that I can see and that I'm using. And it could be that I'm cutting myself more than I'm cutting anything out there. But what I'm rooting around for is a sense of not what should I believe, you know, not the question of what should I believe, but the question of what values have I been born into. The question is, what set of beliefs can I not escape because I am it? And I think there's a point in all rational inquiry, because, you know, philosophy is a path towards rational inquiry. And at a certain point, you can't merely negate. So you could say that the thing about darkness is its connection to negation. And the thing about sunlight is its connection to what? Well, I'd like to say that it's a connection to an affirmation. And I think that affirmation goes hand in hand with the with life itself. And I think that affirmation is related to the Southern humanist. And what I mean to say is that at a certain level, one must affirm themselves also. And that's why I suggest that I'm nervous about my thinking, and yet I'm still affirming myself in my capacity to have thoughts. And all thoughts are experimental. You know, all thoughts are speculative, or at least most thoughts are. And that this is an exercise in that. And so I like to use certain themes, certain general themes and such, as a way of keeping it grounded, because the thing about certain universal themes like sunlight and darkness is that it gives you a certain openness to play. And the thing about thinking for me is that its extemporaneous quality, in the sense that all thinking appears from nowhere and disappears into nowhere, is itself, I think, indicative of another kind of underlying process that we've largely missed out on. And we do become better thinkers by becoming critical. However, critical only means thinking about thinking. Critical thinking, as opposed to normal thinking, is a kind of thinking that is simply self-aware of itself. Thinking, properly understood in my own definition of thinking, isn't a conceptual activity, but is an activity of the senses. And that's because, for me, I'm a reconstructed Aristotelian. And like many thinkers, Aristotle is an impetus, and I am his progeny, like all of us are, except that I, like many, believe that I have the more accurate reading of Aristotle. And I think that Aristotle, unlike Plato, and I think that this was largely overlooked because of the influence of Christianity, as well as the immense power of Plato, that ultimately what has been lost is, within Aristotle, a notion that thinking, when properly understood, isn't to be reduced to rational processes that are somehow magical or somehow unrelated, somehow disconnected from the fleshly, funky, nitty-gritty, concrete, wood, earth world that we live in. And so for Aristotle, he says at one point in one translation that thinking is a sense. And that's astonishing. That's an astonishing claim to say that thinking is a sense. Because what he's suggesting is that thinking isn't necessarily speculative, but that it begins in the body. And so there's a kind of phenomenology in Aristotle that, that's my use of the word, and I hate using that word. I always think I'd like to have a better word than phenomenology, but if phenomenology means being attuned to reality as it's experienced prior to our constant objectification or reification of that reality, it reveals itself in such a way where one begins to see that, as you pay attention, that what Aristotle says seems to be correct, because we are not minds, and so much of what Plato it works with the notion that we are minds, and in many ways it weaves itself into our lives. It's an idea that is built into us that we are minds, and the mind in Plato is a rational thing, but in Christianity it would come to mean the soul. Not that I'm disputing that, but that these are different senses of what thinking is or of what the soul is from an Aristotelian point of view, as I interpret Aristotle. And so in my reconstructed Aristotelian view, and I think of Aristotle not as a systematic thinker in the way that he's usually represented, but as someone who, instead of developing a 4-part theory of truth or whatever in regards to his metaphysics, was in fact playing around. And in fact, he was working out contending theories in regards to what reality is. But what's primary in Aristotle is the terrestrial. That he was looking at the celestial, in other words, the heavens, much like Plato did. But he was also rooted in the terrestrial. He was wading around in those swamps, in those seas, picking up evidence and thinking like a proto-scientist. Of course, he lacked the experimental method, and of course, he was perhaps far out of time in his situatedness. But what he ultimately did was to set in effect a kind of thinking that understood reasoning to be an inductive and not a purely deductive process. And that's a process that would ultimately come to influence figures as diverse as Lucretius and William of Ockham. And if I have any kind of intellectual heritage, it's in this thin thread that goes back to Aristotle. And prior to Aristotle, to me, it goes back to Thales of Miletus, who is given credit for being the first philosopher to think in purely rational terms. Not purely rational, but to think of thinking as something that would be answered in reality itself, that would be answered in nature, as opposed to some immaterial or motivated force outside of nature. And being that I am a naturalist, and being that I am, as I've said 2 times already, a reconstructed Aristotelian, it would make sense that sunlight would come to have a primary quality in my world. And indeed it does. But at the same time, the darkness has a corollary role, because the role of darkness and lightness in my life is that it's a rhythm, and to live on earth means to live in those rhythms of night and day, self and other. And those may be constructions. It may be that the nighttime is simply a social construction of the earth. But it could also be that what I mean to suggest is that I'm attempting to construct a kind of understanding of myself, because so much of what I am, I don't think can be questioned, or it can be questioned so far, but then at a certain point, instead of questioning yourself, you're just starting to see who you are. And I think that what I express in that, or what I think is important in that, is that the celebration of sunlight is a kind of theme that ultimately can open up a lot of doors. And Camus, it came to have a very powerful theme for me, because I come from Arizona, and when I moved away, I would then come back and spend some summers in Arizona. So the title, Summer in Algiers, was always very important to me because of my summers in Arizona. And interestingly, as I grew and as I returned to that piece in Camus, I can't escape the fact that he feels so much to be like a kind of brother to me. And in many ways, he helped me to understand that poverty can be a very powerful thing. Because poverty, in other words, if you don't have something protecting you from that sunlight, from the burning facts of reality, then you will ultimately grow on a deeper level. And so some people may be born into comfort and luxury and money and privilege, but it doesn't mean anything, because they may in fact be given the very thing that will prevent them from becoming something that is more than just a collection of occupations and artifacts ultimately. And so that's the question that is posited by philosophers, and it may not even be a real question, or it may not even be a real idea, that you can grow, or that difficulty can be good for you. And it's interesting to even think of philosophy in that way. What would philosophy be if it were to be understood as a way of addressing challenges in a modified, careful way? I suppose that's another thing worth thinking through. But I think these themes are also connected to the degree to which the sunlight keeps us aware of our own lack of solidity. That the sunlight in itself keeps us grounded in reality as it is, and not in the reality that we would like to believe is there. You know, you could say that if we're escaping Plato, if Plato represents a particular kind of regression in the history of human thought, then the way that we escape Plato isn't by outthinking him, but by simply leaving the cool, cozy darkness, air-conditioned splendor of my own apartment, which is an air-conditioned heaven, sort of the opposite of Henry Miller's air-conditioned hell. And so I think that the sunlight, which I've been learning to love more and more over the years, given that I spent most of my adult life living at night, sort of living like a ninja, waking up in the afternoon every day, and then staying up all night doing my thing. My life ultimately turned as I explained it to myself. I sort of came back home to earth. And what I mean by that is that at a very practical level, I started getting up earlier and leaving my place and going on walks. And walks can be difficult in the summertime, but ultimately that difficulty is something that burns away what is weak in you. And there are a lot of scientifically related or scientifically explained chemical processes that go into effect every time you take a walk. And it's no wonder that I'm able to do these recordings while I'm walking, given that there's definitely a relation between the two acts. And so for me, the sunlight is related to the reality of life that's always waiting outside of your door. It's always waiting outside of your little world where everything is ordered and protected. And I think that's what I'm trying to draw out of my understanding in Camus. Because I think Camus understood catastrophe. And I'm not saying that I had any kind of experience that's anything like what Camus would have experienced coming where he came from, or that I can relate to anyone. But I think each of us has to think on our own. And I think that if I'm to think dangerously and to think on my own, I would say that what I have in common with Camus is the built-in anti-romantic love for sunlight. And I know that a lot of this is very complicated and unnecessarily silly, or it sounds silly, But to me, it's very important because Plato understood himself to being one that is opening up to the sunlight, to be one who is leaving the darkness and entering the light. But is that really the case? You know, Plato ultimately cut himself off from the actual sensuous world, from the physical world. At least he does largely, not all of Plato, but there is a sense in which what I'm working with is that the way out of the cave is out of Plato. Plato is the cave. And so that's ironic because Plato is ultimately suggesting that he has a ladder. He has a way out, you know. His epistemology, in fact, is understood to be a kind of ladder that in figures like Plotinus would come to have a whole other kind of almost Baroque metaphysical quality. But all of this to me is juxtaposed with the sunlit world of reality, which is one that is real, but is not understood according to simple, neat, rational processes, but is something that is lived in and something that is not taken for granted. And it is something that is a lesson in itself, because the lesson of poverty is that you should be careful about those expectations you set. Like if you really think that you're so high or that you should have a certain life, you're going to be hurt so bad that you might never recover. And that if you're born into a situation where all is not well, where there is horrible things happening, well, I'm not a negative person, but reality is horrible. Reality is absolutely vicious. If you're thinking about it in terms of what it can be and what it is, you should be intimately aware of the fact that you too will be swallowed whole and that all of us are heading towards kind of oblivion. It's not a negative thing in itself because one determines their own relation to that oblivion. That, I think, is what makes me a kind of existential humanist. And I think you could understand Camus to be an existential humanist, and that could be a better word for what is described. But I like the word solar because it ties it into that world where everything is blanched out and bleached out, and yet in that minimalist landscape of the desert, what do you discover? Well, you discover the beautiful brown bodies of these women and these men who play in the sea. You find not only the tyranny of sunlight and Camus, but also the cool Mediterranean Sea. And so for me, it wasn't merely the hot Arizona sun that monopolized my childhood. It was also the cool Colorado River, which I tasted for the first time when I was about 10 years old, 11 years old. And that in itself came to have on an archetypal meaning to me. So there was then a relationship between that cool Colorado River water and then the hot Arizona sun. And I think it's in the relation between those archetypal qualities that my own psyche was formed. And that's why, again, I think of myself as a solar humanist, not because I believe in sunlight alone, but because I believe in that cool Colorado River. And that's what I affirm. You know, one could say that it's not the darkness, but the sun that negates. And if it's the sun that negates, then it's water that fills in that void, or that fills up that void. It's as if, like, the point of negation, of skepticism, of a ruthless criticism isn't to continue the criticism or even to replace what is criticized with something better, but to allow life, the fullness of life, the unstoppable plenitude of life, to let that speak on its own terms. I think that is the point of Poverty and Sunlight and Albert Camus. Signing off.